December 7th, 1944, 5:43 hours. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski cannot feel his fingers anymore. 3 days of monsoon rain have turned his foxhole into a shallow grave of mud and standing water, and the stock of his Browning automatic rifle, the bar his squad calls Betty, is slick with moisture that no amount of oilcloth can absorb. The weight of it across his knees is familiar, comforting even. 20 pounds of walnut and steel that has kept him alive through Paliliu and now here, in this godforsaken jungle where the enemy moves like smoke through the bamboo thickets. But tonight, Betty is different. Tonight, she carries something the Ordnance sergeant delivered in a wooden crate marked with 3 red stripes and a single word stenciled in black: experimental. The ammunition bandolier across Kowalski's chest holds magazines unlike any he has loaded before. Each .30-06 cartridge bears a distinctive crimson band painted precisely 1/8 inch below the neck, and when the lieutenant handed them out at dusk, his instructions were explicit. Do not, under any circumstances, discuss these rounds. Do not write home about them. If you are captured, you will swallow your dog tags before you let the enemy examine your ammunition. The kind of orders that make your throat tight, that transform routine weapon maintenance into something approaching ritual. Kowalski has been killing men with the Browning automatic rifle for 11 months now. He knows the weapon's rhythm as intimately as his own heartbeat, the sharp crack of its report, the way it climbs and pulls right after the 8th round, the particular smell of cordite that clings to his uniform after sustained fire. A barman learns quickly or dies. Short, controlled bursts to preserve ammunition, never more than 6 rounds at a time despite what the Hollywood films show. The standard 20-round magazine empties in less than 3 seconds on full automatic. And in the jungle, where reload time can measure the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the ferns, every second is an eternity measured in blood. But these red-banded rounds are supposed to change the mathematics of survival. 40 yards to his front, something moves in the darkness between the nipa palms. Not the wind. The rain has gentled to drizzle, and the night has grown still with the peculiar silence that precedes violence. Kowalski's thumb finds the fire selector, clicks it from safe to automatic. His breathing slows. The rustling becomes footsteps, careful and deliberate, and then he sees them. Shadows resolving into men. Imperial Japanese Army infantry advancing in a loose skirmish line, perhaps a dozen strong, their Type 38 rifles held at port arms. They are close enough that he can hear the wet squelch of their split-toed Tabi boots in the mud, close enough that he can see the dull gleam of their bayonets. He centers the rear sight on the lead soldier's chest and squeezes the trigger. What happens next will be reported in after-action documents as effects consistent with catastrophic ammunition performance. What Kowalski experiences, crouched in his flooded foxhole with rain stinging his eyes, is something approaching the supernatural. The bar buckets in his hands with familiar authority, but the sound it makes is wrong. Each shot is not a single crack, but a sharp double report, crack boom, like thunder breaking directly overhead. And the men he shoots do not simply fall. They are flung backward as if struck by an invisible fist, their bodies jerking with impacts that spray dark mist into the rain. And in the muzzle flash, he sees one soldier's torso literally come apart at the ribs, the entire chest cavity opening like a horrible flower. The Japanese line dissolves into chaos. Men scatter into the undergrowth, their advance broken, and Kowalski fires until the magazine runs dry. 20 rounds in under 4 seconds, and the silence that follows is broken only by screaming from the jungle, high and wavering and utterly inhuman. His hands shake as he reloads, and it is not from fear. It is from the weight of understanding that he has just witnessed something that changes the fundamental nature of infantry combat, something that transforms the rifle from a tool of precision into an instrument of devastation. What Private Kowalski does not know, crouched in the mud of Leyte with his ears ringing and his heart hammering against his ribs, is that the red-banded ammunition in his bar is the culmination of 3 years of desperate innovation, a weapons program born from the bloodiest lessons of the Pacific Campaign. He does not know that the rounds he has just fired contain a secret that will never appear in official histories, that will be deliberately erased from ordnance records, that will remain classified until men who fought this war are grandfathers telling stories that their children do not quite believe. He does not know that what he holds in his hands is something the enemy will come to call Kaminari Kimona, the Thunder Beast. To understand how American ordnance engineers arrived at the decision to pack explosive charges into rifle ammunition, one must first understand the unique and horrifying nature of jungle warfare in the Pacific Theater. By the winter of 1944, the United States Marine Corps and Army had paid for their advance across the Central Pacific in a currency of blood that staggers comprehension. On Tarawa, November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division suffered 3,407 casualties in 76 hours, a casualty rate of nearly 20%. On Peleliu, September to November 1944, the 1st Marine Division lost 6,786 men, with some rifle companies reduced to 20% effective strength. The statistics were not merely sobering. They were apocalyptic, and they demanded answers that traditional infantry tactics could not provide. The problem was this: Japanese defensive doctrine in the Pacific had evolved into a system of interlocking bunkers, cave complexes, and spider holes that transformed every advance into a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Imperial Army soldiers, indoctrinated with Bushido philosophy that death was preferable to surrender, would conceal themselves in fighting positions so cunningly camouflaged that American infantrymen would walk past them without detection, only to be shot in the back at ranges of 10 to 15 yards. The traditional doctrine of suppressive fire and maneuver, tactics that worked brilliantly in the open terrain of North Africa and Europe, became exercises in futility when the enemy refused to be suppressed, when wounded Japanese soldiers would feign death and then detonate grenades as medics approached, when a single sniper could hold up an entire platoon for hours from a palm tree no one could locate. And the Browning automatic rifle, for all its qualities as a light machine gun, was revealed to possess a fatal flaw in this environment: inadequate immediate stopping power. The bar was a magnificent weapon, beloved by the men who carried it. Designed by John Moses Browning in 1917, adopted by the Army in 1918, it fired the standard .30-06 Springfield cartridge at a rate of 550 rounds per minute from a 20-round detachable box magazine. It was reliable, accurate to 600 yards, and relatively light at 16 pounds unloaded. A trained barman could lay down suppressive fire that would make riflemen dive for cover, could sweep a tree line with controlled bursts that sounded like an industrial saw cutting through timber. In the hands of a skilled operator, it was the most potent individual weapon in the American infantry arsenal. But the .30-06 round it fired, while powerful by any reasonable metric, was fundamentally a rifle cartridge designed for precision, not devastation. A standard ball round consisted of a 150-grain copper-jacketed lead projectile, leaving the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. When it struck a human body, it would punch through tissue and bone with the efficiency of a nail driven through pine wood, a clean, narrow wound channel that, while certainly lethal, did not always produce immediate incapacitation. Japanese soldiers, many of whom weighed less than 130 pounds and possessed a pain tolerance amplified by fanatical ideology and amphetamine-based performance drugs, could absorb multiple .30-06 hits and continue fighting long enough to kill the man who shot them. The after-action reports from Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Peleliu were filled with accounts that defied belief. Marines reported shooting enemy soldiers 5, 6, 7 times center mass, watching the impact strike home, and then watching those same soldiers rise from the ground and charge with bayonets fixed or detonate demolition charges. A bar gunner from the 7th Marines wrote in his diary, "Shot a Jap rifleman twice in the chest at maybe 20 feet. Saw the impacts, both good hits. He went down, I moved forward, and the son of a bitch came up out of the ferns and nearly got me with his bayonet. Had to put 3 more rounds into him before he stayed down." How do you kill something that won't die? It was a question that the Ordnance Department at Aberdeen Proving Ground had been wrestling with since late 1943, and by the spring of 1944, they believed they had found an answer. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. If a standard rifle bullet could not generate sufficient immediate incapacitation, what if the bullet itself became a tiny explosive charge? What if, instead of relying solely on kinetic energy to create a wound, The projectile could detonate inside the target, creating a pressure wave that would destroy tissue far beyond the diameter of the wound channel. The physics were sound. Explosives generate overpressure that propagates through fluid medium, and the human body is 70% water. A small explosion inside a torso would not merely punch a hole. It would liquidate organs, shatter bone, and create a temporary cavity so massive that survival would be physiologically impossible. The technical challenge was formidable. Standard explosive compounds like TNT were too stable to detonate from the shock of rifle barrel acceleration and impact. They required detonators, which were far too large to fit inside a rifle bullet. Picric acid and other primary explosives were sensitive enough to detonate on impact, but they were also sensitive enough to detonate during handling or inside the rifle chamber or from the heat generated by rapid fire. What was needed was an explosive compound that existed in the narrow window between too stable and too unstable, paired with a delivery system that could withstand 50,000 pounds per square inch of chamber pressure without premature detonation. The answer came from an unlikely source: Research Department Explosive, or RDX, a compound developed by the British in 1899 and largely ignored for 40 years until the demands of modern warfare required explosives more powerful than TNT. RDX possessed 158 of TNT's detonation velocity and could be pressed into shapes and densities that made it suitable for specialized applications. More importantly, when mixed with plasticizers and wax into a putty-like substance the British called Composition B, it became stable enough to survive the brutal acceleration forces inside a rifle barrel while remaining sensitive enough to detonate upon high-velocity impact with a solid target. In July 1944, engineers at Frankford Arsenal in Philadelphia began manufacturing what the Ordnance designation system called the .30 caliber M2 high explosive round, though in practice it was never issued in official nomenclature because it was never officially approved for service. The manufacturing process was delicate to the point of obsession. Standard 150-grain .30-06 bullets had their lead cores partially removed and replaced with an RDX-based explosive compound weighing approximately 4 grains, about 260 milligrams, roughly equivalent to a match head. The explosive cavity was sealed with a copper disc and crimped shut, creating a projectile that looked, to casual inspection, exactly like a standard ball round except for one distinguishing feature: a crimson band painted around the cartridge case neck as a recognition and safety marking. The ballistic performance was exceptional. The explosive-filled bullets achieved muzzle velocities within 50 feet per second of standard ammunition, meaning point of aim was virtually unchanged. Accuracy degradation was minimal. The rounds would still group within 4 inches at 300 yards, more than sufficient for the close-range jungle combat they were designed for. And the terminal effects, when tested on ballistic gelatin blocks, cadavers, and ultimately live animals, were beyond anything in the history of small arms ammunition. A standard .30-06 round would create a permanent wound cavity approximately 1 inch in diameter. The M2 round created temporary wound cavities exceeding 8 inches, with pressure waves sufficient to rupture organs 20 inches from the point of impact. But there was a critical limitation that prevented widespread adoption, and it was this limitation that ultimately confined the M2 to experimental status. The rounds could only be safely fired from manually loaded weapons. The explosive compound, while stable enough to survive being fired, was sensitive enough that the shock of being stripped from a magazine and chambered at high speed, the violent metal-on-metal collision that occurs thousands of times per second in automatic weapons, could cause detonation inside the weapon itself. The Browning automatic rifle, with its relatively gentle gas-operated action and slow cyclic rate, was deemed marginally safe for use with M2 ammunition, but only with careful loading and only in magazines that had been inspected for burrs or deformities. The result was a weapon system that existed in a gray zone of military capability, devastatingly effective when it worked, potentially catastrophic when it didn't, and too labor-intensive and expensive to manufacture in the quantities needed for general issue. The Ordnance Department's solution was to classify the ammunition and release it only to select units in the Pacific Theater for field evaluation, with explicit instructions that the rounds were experimental that their existence was classified secret, and that under no circumstances were they to be mentioned in official reports unless absolutely necessary for operational understanding. Between August and December 1944, approximately 47,000 rounds of M2 ammunition were shipped to Pacific Commands in wooden crates marked with red diagonal stripes and vague designations like Ordnance Stores, Special, or Ammunition, Experimental, Evaluation. The rounds were distributed to Marine and Army units engaged in active combat operations on Peleliu, Leyte, Mindoro, and the smaller islands of the Philippines campaign. The men who received them were given no technical briefing beyond basic safety protocols. Load the magazines by hand. Do not drop the ammunition. Do not expose it to open flame. Do not discuss it. And report results through command channels only. And the results, when they began filtering back to Aberdeen Proving Ground through after-action reports and intelligence summaries, were extraordinary. Sergeant Raymond Almeida, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, Peleliu, October 1944. Engaged enemy position at approximately 40 meters. Expended 18 rounds ammunition in 2 magazines. Observed 4 enemy Kia with catastrophic wounds. Remainder of position abandoned. Enemy subsequent attacks on this sector declined by estimated 70% following engagement. Attribution unknown. Lieutenant Howard Chun, 3rd Battalion, 32nd Infantry Regiment, Leyte, November 1944. Bar team equipped with experimental ammunition successfully repelled Banzai attack at close range. Estimated 30 enemy combatants. Immediate casualties estimated at 12, with wounds inconsistent with standard ball ammunition. Survivors exhibited extreme reluctance to close with position for remainder of engagement. Psychological effect appears significant. The psychological effect. That phrase appeared again and again in the intelligence summaries, and it pointed to something the ordnance engineers had not anticipated. The weapon's greatest asset might not be its lethality, but its capacity to terrorize. The sound of the M2 rounds detonating on impact was distinctive, a sharp crack boom that carried across jungle terrain with unmistakable authority. Japanese soldiers, trained to identify weapons by their auditory signatures, had never heard anything like it. The double report suggested something between a rifle and an artillery round, something that existed outside their tactical experience. And when that sound was coupled with the visual evidence of what the rounds did to human bodies, the explosive dismemberment, the massive exit wounds, the way men hit by the bullets seemed to simply disintegrate. It created a psychological effect that transcended mere physical danger. By December 1944, American intelligence officers were intercepting Japanese radio communications that referenced Kaminari Kimona, the Thunder Beast, a weapon that killed with lightning and thunder that could not be countered or survived. Captured diaries from Japanese soldiers revealed references to devil bullets and American demon rifles that exploded inside the body. One interrogation report from a captured corporal of the 16th Division taken on Leyte in December 1944 stated, "We were told the Americans had developed a new automatic rifle that fired explosive shells like a grenade launcher. After we saw what it did to Sergeant Tanaka, his chest was open like someone had detonated a charge inside him. We believed it. No one wanted to attack positions where we heard that sound. It was like attacking a machine gun nest, but worse, because at least a machine gun just shoots bullets. This thing made men explode. The fear was not irrational. The M2 round transformed the Browning automatic rifle from a squad automatic weapon into something approaching a crew-served weapons system in terms of psychological impact. A single bar gunner with 100 rounds of explosive ammunition could deny an approach corridor as effectively as a heavy machine gun, not because the weapon could fire faster or more accurately, but because every burst carried the implicit threat of instant obliteration. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized speed and aggression in the attack, the philosophy that closing rapidly with the enemy would negate American firepower advantages. But speed meant nothing when a single hit anywhere on the torso was unsurvivable, when the weapon created wounds so catastrophic that even immediate medical attention was futile. And the men who carried those weapons understood, with the peculiar clarity that comes from facing death daily, that they held an advantage their enemy could not match. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, still crouched in his foxhole on Leyte as dawn breaks gray and wet over the Philippine jungle, ejects the spent magazine from his bar and slides it into his ammo pouch. The fresh magazine he loads contains standard ball ammunition. The red-banded rounds are too precious to waste on anything but confirmed targets. And his hands are steady now, the adrenaline shock of contact fading into the exhausted clarity of survival. Around him, the jungle is silent except for the drip of water from the canopy and the distant sound of someone screaming in Japanese, a sound that trails off into wet gurgling and then stops. When the sun is fully up and the platoon advances through the area where the Japanese attack originated, they find 7 bodies. 3 of them are identifiable as having been killed by standard rifle fire. Neat entrance wounds, larger exit wounds, the familiar evidence of kinetic penetration. 4 of them are not identifiable as having been killed by anything the corpsmen have seen before. One man's torso has been opened from sternum to spine, the ribcage splayed outward and the internal organs reduced to pulp. Another has no identifiable face, the skull having been fragmented into pieces no larger than a thumb. The corpsmen, veterans of Guadalcanal and Polillo, men who have seen what high explosives and flamethrowers do to the human body, stand over the remains with expressions approaching awe. "What the hell did that?" one of them asks. "Bar," Kowalski says, and says nothing else, because his orders were explicit and because there are some things that feel wrong to talk about, even in the company of men who understand. The lieutenant collects the empty magazines and counts the remaining red-banded rounds, makes a notation in a small notebook that will be transcribed into an after-action report and forwarded up the chain of command until it reaches a desk at Frankford Arsenal, where an engineer will read it and make his own notation in a file that will eventually be stamped secret and locked in a cabinet that will remain sealed for 35 years. And that is how history forgets, how weapons disappear from the record, how wars are fought with tools that officially do not exist. But the war does not care about official records. The war cares only about what works, about what keeps men alive, about what breaks the enemy's will to fight. And in the winter of 1944, on islands whose names most Americans cannot pronounce, the Browning automatic rifle loaded with M2 high-explosive ammunition is working better than anyone anticipated. On Mindoro, December 17, 1944, a squad from the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment uses 3 magazines of M2 rounds to break up a Japanese counterattack in a coconut grove, killing 11 enemy soldiers and wounding an estimated 6 more. The survivors abandon their equipment and withdraw to cave complexes in the interior, and intelligence reports note that subsequent patrols in that sector encounter no resistance for 48 hours, an anomaly in a campaign characterized by fanatical defense of every position. On Leyte, December 25, 1944, Christmas Day, a Marine bar team uses M2 ammunition to suppress a bunker complex that had resisted demolition charges and flamethrowers for 3 days. The explosive rounds, fired through the bunker's firing slit at a range of 30 yards, detonate against the interior walls and create overpressure effects that kill or incapacitate the occupants without destroying the structure itself. The position is secured without friendly casualties, and the company commander's report describes the ammunition as highly effective in negating fortified positions without excessive expenditure of ordnance. The words are bloodless, technical, the language of men who must describe horror in terms that can be typed into forms and filed in triplicate. They do not capture what it feels like to see a man struck by a bullet that detonates inside his body, the way the impact creates a visible shockwave that ripples across the skin, the wet explosion of blood mist that hangs in the humid air. They do not capture the sound, the peculiar crack boom that becomes audible even through the chaos of combat, that makes men flinch even when they know the weapon is on their side. They do not capture the smell, which is not the clean cordite smell of standard ammunition, but something more organic, the scent of explosives mixed with the copper penny smell of blood and the sulfurous stink of ruptured intestines. And they certainly do not capture the weight that settles on the men who fire those rounds, the understanding that they are using a weapon that exists on the boundary between warfare and atrocity, that would almost certainly be classified as illegal if anyone in authority chose to examine it too closely. that kills with such devastating efficiency that it transforms the fundamental mathematics of infantry combat from a contest of skill and courage into something approaching industrial slaughter. But this is December 1944, and the war in the Pacific is a war of extermination fought according to rules that exist only in the abstract, and the men who carry the red-banded ammunition do not have the luxury of moral philosophy. They have the luxury of survival, which in the jungles of the Philippines is its own form of moral clarity. Corporal Michael Brennan, a bar gunner from the Bronx who carries the M2 rounds through the liberation of Manila in February 1945, will write in a letter home that will be censored and never delivered. I can't tell you what I'm shooting or why it works the way it does, but I can tell you this. When we hit them, they go down and they stay down. No more of this shooting a man 5 times and watching him get back up. No more worrying that the guy you just killed is going to pull a grenade and take you with him. When we hit them with this, there's no question. It's not like killing. It's like erasing. And I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse. The letter will be found in Brennan's effects after he is killed by a Japanese sniper on March 3, 1945, 5 days before Manila is declared secure. The red-banded magazines will be collected from his body by the platoon sergeant, redistributed to other bar men, and fired in combat until they are expended, at which point they will cease to exist in any official capacity. By March 1945, as American forces prepare for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the strategic calculus surrounding the M2 ammunition has shifted. The Ordnance Department, reviewing the after-action reports and the ammunition expenditure data, has reached several conclusions. First, the rounds are extraordinarily effective at achieving immediate incapacitation and possess significant psychological deterrent value. Second, the manufacturing process is too complex and expensive to sustain for general issue, requiring skilled ordnance technicians and specialized equipment that could be better utilized producing more conventional munitions. Third, the safety concerns, while manageable in the hands of trained infantry, present an unacceptable risk in less controlled environments or with less disciplined troops. And fourth, perhaps most significantly, the weapon's existence represents a potential propaganda liability if knowledge of it reaches the enemy or neutral nations, as explosive rifle bullets occupy a gray area in the laws of warfare that the United States government would prefer not to debate in international forums. The decision is made to cease production. The remaining stockpiles, estimated at approximately 23,000 rounds still in Pacific Theater depots, are to be expended through normal combat operations and not replaced. No formal documentation of the weapon system is to be created beyond what already exists in classified Ordnance Department files. Units currently employing the ammunition are to be allowed to use it until exhausted, at which point it will be recorded as ammunition, rifle, caliber .30, ball, M2, in expenditure reports, indistinguishable from standard rounds. The red-banded rounds are to disappear into the vast bureaucratic machinery of wartime logistics, a classified program that will end not with a decision memorandum or an official order, but simply by fading from memory. On Okinawa, April through June 1945, scattered reports of M2 ammunition use appear in after-action documents, usually in the form of casualty assessments that note wounds inconsistent with standard small arms fire. A Japanese officer's diary, captured on May 15, describes an engagement near Shuri Castle where American automatic riflemen inflicted casualties with shells that explode inside the body, leaving wounds like those from a grenade but from a rifle. By June, as the campaign grinds toward its bloody conclusion, such reports cease. The ammunition is gone, expended, erased from the operational record. And in August 1945, when atomic weapons incinerate Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Japanese Empire surrenders unconditionally, the Thunder Beast becomes a footnote to a footnote. A classified weapons program that existed for 10 months, produced fewer than 50,000 rounds, and killed perhaps 300 to 400 enemy soldiers with such efficiency that it terrified men who had been trained since childhood to embrace death. The official history will record none of this. The histories of the Browning automatic rifle will discuss the M1918, the M1918A2, the various modifications to the bipod and the barrel, The weapon's service life from the Meuse-Argonne offensive of 1918 to the jungles of Vietnam in 1968. They will note the weapon's beloved status among infantrymen, its reliability, its firepower, its weight. They will not mention that for 10 months in 1944 and 1945, some of those rifles fired bullets that exploded inside the target, that created wounds so catastrophic that medical personnel could not identify the cause of death, that generated a psychological effect so profound that enemy soldiers would rather die in cave-ins and starvation than face them in open combat. But the men who carried those weapons, who loaded those magazines by hand in foxholes and spider holes and behind bullet-riddled logs, who heard the distinctive crack boom of detonation and saw what it did to human bodies, those men remember. Not because they want to, but because some things burn themselves into memory with an intensity that time cannot erase. Sergeant Raymond Almeida, who fired 60 rounds of M2 ammunition in 4 separate engagements on Polilliu, returns to Fresno, California in February 1946. He will work as a mechanic, raise 3 children, serve on the city council, live an unremarkable life distinguished only by his absolute refusal to discuss his military service beyond the vaguest generalities. In 1979, when a historian researching the Polilliu campaign asks him about experimental ammunition, he will stare at her for a long moment and then say, "I don't know what you're talking about. We use standard .30-06. Same as everybody else." And he will believe it, because he has spent 34 years teaching himself to believe it. Because the alternative is to remember the sound of those rounds detonating in flesh, the weight of the magazines in his hands, the look on the faces of men who understood they were carrying something that should not exist. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski, who survived Leyte and Okinawa and returned to Pittsburgh with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star and night terrors that will fade but never fully disappear, will keep a single red-banded cartridge in a drawer in his workshop for 50 years. He will never tell anyone where it came from or what it represents. In 1995, 3 months before he dies of prostate cancer, his grandson will find the cartridge while helping him clean out the workshop and will ask about the red stripe. Kowalski will take the round, turn it over in his hands, and say, "That's from the war. That's from when we had to do things we don't talk about." And then he will place it in a coffee can with his dog tags and his discharge papers and instruct his grandson to bury it with him. And his grandson will honor that request without understanding why. Corporal Michael Brennan, who never made it home from Manila, is buried in the American cemetery outside the city, Plot E, Row 7, Grave 143. His headstone makes no mention of the weapon he carried or the ammunition he fired. It states simply that he was a corporal in the United States Army, that he died in service to his country, that he was 22 years old. There is nothing on the stone to indicate that for 6 weeks in the winter of 1945, he carried a rifle that made thunder, that his weapon became something the enemy called a beast, that he killed with a precision and finality that transcended traditional warfare. But in the cemetery, when the wind moves through the rows of white crosses, there is sometimes a sound like distant thunder, and the old Filipinos who maintain the grounds cross themselves and say that it is the sound of the American soldiers who fought so hard to free their islands, that the dead remember even when the living choose to forget. The Browning automatic rifle remained in American service until 1968, when it was gradually replaced by the M60 machine gun and the M16 rifle. Thousands of them were sold as surplus, demilitarized, and purchased by collectors who prize them for their historical significance and mechanical elegance. If you examine one closely, inspect the chamber and the barrel, you will find nothing to indicate that some of them, for a brief period in a forgotten corner of a global war, fired bullets that exploded. The weapons themselves kept no secrets. They were merely tools, indifferent to the ammunition they chambered, concerned only with the physics of gas pressure and mechanical timing. But the men who used them understood that certain tools, in certain hands, in certain moments, acquire a weight that transcends their physical substance. The bar, loaded with standard ball ammunition, was a fine weapon, beloved and effective. The bar loaded with red-banded M2 rounds was something else, something that lived in the space between tactical necessity and moral event horizon, something that worked so well that its very effectiveness became an argument for its suppression. In the end, The Thunder Beast existed for less than a year, killed fewer enemy soldiers than a single company of riflemen, and disappeared from history with barely a trace. But in that brief existence, it revealed a truth about technological warfare that remains relevant today: that the most effective weapons are not always the ones that kill the most people, but the ones that destroy the enemies will fight. The M2 round killed with such devastating finality that it transformed combat from a test of courage into a test of terror. It created casualties so graphically horrifying that other soldiers would abandon positions rather than face it. It made a sound that carried across jungles and meant death in a form that could not be survived or escaped. And perhaps that is why it was erased from the historical record. Not because it was ineffective, but because it was too effective, because it represented a kind of warfare that civilized nations prefer not to acknowledge even when they practice it. The men who authorized its development, who manufactured it, who distributed it to combat units, understood that they were creating something that existed in a moral gray zone, something that would be difficult to justify if examined too closely by ethicists or international observers. Better to let it disappear, to allow it to become a ghost story told by veterans who could never quite prove what they had seen, who would eventually die and take the story with them. But the story persists in classified files that remain sealed, in the memories of men who are now mostly gone, in the occasional reference in a captured Japanese diary or an after-action report footnote that mentions experimental ordnance without elaboration. The Thunder Beast lived for 10 months and then vanished, but it left marks on the men who knew it, carried it, fired it in anger and desperation and with the cold calculation of survival. December 1944 to August 1945. Red-banded cartridges and magazines loaded by hand. The crack boom of detonation. Bodies torn open by explosions no larger than a match head. Enemies who fled rather than face it. Allies who used it and then never spoke of it. A weapon that was too effective to be allowed, too destructive to be justified, too classified to be remembered. They called them Thunder Beasts, those rifles. The name was not official, never appeared in any military nomenclature, existed only in enemy diaries and the whispered conversations of men who had seen what the weapons could do. But it was accurate in ways that official designations never are, because it captured the essential truth of the thing, that certain weapons, in certain moments, acquire a mythology that transcends their mechanical function, that becomes symbols of something larger than themselves. The Browning automatic rifle was a machine that converted chemical energy into kinetic energy with admirable efficiency. But the Browning automatic rifle loaded with M2 high-explosive ammunition was something more. It was thunder and lightning compressed into 20 pounds of walnut and steel, a weapon that killed not just with physics, but with psychological force, that created a zone of terror around itself that was as much a defensive perimeter as barbed wire or landmines. And the men who carried it, those privates and corporals and sergeants who loaded the red-banded magazines in the rain and the mud and the blood, who fired them at enemy soldiers rushing through the bamboo, who watched those soldiers come apart like paper dolls in a hurricane. Those men understood that they had been given a power that came with a price. The price was memory, the weight of having used something so devastating that it felt less like warfare and more like execution. The price was silence, the burden of carrying a secret that could not be shared, that would not be believed even if spoken aloud. The price was the knowledge that in the mathematics of survival, they had been given an advantage so profound that it felt almost like cheating, except that war has no rules against effectiveness, only rules against getting caught. They carried that price home with them, those men. They carried it through the victory parades and the job interviews and the births of children and the slow accumulation of years that transforms young warriors into old men with stories no one wants to hear. They carried it in silence, because they had been ordered to, and because some experiences resist language, exist in a space beyond words where only those who were there can truly understand. And now they are mostly gone, those men. The last veterans of the Pacific War are in their 90s if they are alive at all, and their memories are fading like old photographs left too long in sunlight. Soon there will be no one left who remembers the Thunder Beast, no one who can describe the sound it made, the weight it carried, the way it changed the nature of combat for 10 months in 1944 and 1945. The weapon will become completely mythological, a story that historians debate without resolution, a classified program that may or may not have existed depending on which fragmentary documents you choose to believe. But in the jungles of the Philippines, on Leyte and Mindoro and the smaller islands whose names appear only on military maps, there are places where the bamboo grows in strange patterns, where certain clearings have remained empty for 80 years, where local people still find fragments of metal that bear red paint and will not touch them because the old stories say they are cursed. And perhaps they are cursed, or perhaps they are simply remnants of a weapon that was too effective to be remembered, too devastating to be acknowledged, too classified to be mourned. Thunder beasts. The name echoes across 8 decades, across the graves of men who carried them and men who died from them, across the bureaucratic silence of governments that chose to forget rather than explain. A weapon that existed in the gray spaces of classified programs and experimental ordnance, that killed with such finality that it terrified an enemy trained since childhood to embrace death, that was so effective it had to be erased from history to preserve the illusion that warfare can be civilized. But wars are not civilized. Wars are industrial processes for converting young men into corpses, and the tools of that conversion are judged not by their elegance or their compliance with international conventions, but by their effectiveness at keeping your men alive and the other side's men dead. The M2 high-explosive round, fired from a Browning automatic rifle by a frightened 20-year-old private in a flooded foxhole, achieved that objective with a clarity that transcended moral philosophy. It worked. It worked so well that men who survived the war spent 50 years trying to forget it worked, trying to convince themselves that they had fired standard ammunition, that the bodies they saw torn apart were victims of artillery or grenades or anything other than a rifle bullet the size of a thumb. But memory is not so easily controlled, and truth has a weight that does not diminish with time. The Thunder Beast existed. Men carried it, fired it, killed with it, and were killed despite it. For 10 months in the worst war in human history, a select number of American infantrymen possessed a weapon that made thunder, and that thunder echoed across jungles and through enemy nightmares and into a classified silence that persists to this day. And perhaps that is the final truth worth remembering, that in the crucible of total war, nations will develop weapons they cannot acknowledge, soldiers will use tools they cannot discuss, and history will record victories without mentioning the methods that achieved them. The Thunder Beast was real. The red-banded cartridges were real. The men who carried them were real. And the silence that followed was the price of a effectiveness too devastating to celebrate, too classified to commemorate, too true to deny. They called them Thunder Beasts. And for 10 months in the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945, when young men fought and died in jungles whose names they could not pronounce for reasons they barely understood, those beasts roared with a voice that combined technology and terror into something that transcended both. And then they fell silent, and the silence has lasted 80 years, and will likely last until the last man who heard that thunder has joined his brothers in the cemeteries, where white crosses stand in perfect rows, and the wind makes sounds that the living cannot quite interpret. Thunder beasts. Experimental ordnance. Classified programs. Weapons that existed in the spaces between official history and lived experience. The war produced many such ghosts. This was merely one of them, but it was one that men remembered, even when they tried very hard to forget.